So the other week, I was at the Carolina Balloon Festival here in North Carolina. My wife and I wanted to do the whole tethered balloon ride for our anniversary. That's where they take you up in a hot air balloon about 80 feet, and the whole thing is tied to the ground so you don't float off anywhere. We didn't want to do the whole untethered ride thing. It's a bit pricey. Plus, the thought of floating hundreds of feet in the air in a wicker basket suspended from a big balloon just doesn't sound like a good idea to me. Never mind my tiny slight fear of heights. Anyways, while waiting in line at the festival, I just had to look into hot air balloon disasters. Because doing this podcast has not twisted my brain at all to make me think, what's the worst damn thing that could happen for whatever it is I'm currently doing? And that would be the hot air balloon crash that happened in Luxor, Egypt on February 26, 2013. So, what happened? I'm Andrew, and this is History's a Disaster. Tonight, we're going all the way over to Egypt for a horrific crash involving a hot air balloon. And tonight's episode is brought to you by the Leaky Pipe Bar and Grill, now under new management and with an expanded dessert bar including Bananas Foster and Cherries Jubilee. Now, hot air balloons have been around for over 200 years, with the first hot air balloon, the Aerostat Revillon, where the hell that is in French, being launched by a French scientist named Pilatar de Rosière. It had 3 passengers, a rooster, a duck, and a sheep, and it managed to stay afloat for 15 minutes before it came crashing back down to the ground. Just 2 months later, on November 21st, 2 French brothers, Joseph and Etienne Montgolfier, conducted the first manned flight. They launched their balloon in Paris, and the flight lasted 20 minutes, which would end up leading to the popularization of hot air ballooning through the 1800s until the plane was invented in the early 1900s, when it kind of fell to the wayside. Until the 1960s, when Ed Yost came up with what is considered the modern hot air balloon, which used a propane burner system, making them safer and easier to fly. They fly by heating the air inside the balloon, which is called an envelope for some reason, to around 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And since hot air is lighter than cold air, this causes the envelope to float and carry the basket into the air. To go higher, you heat the air more with the burner. To go lower, you have to wait for the air to cool off or vent it out the top of the balloon. And there is no way to steer the damn thing. You're at the mercy of whatever way the wind is blowing. The only way to change directions is to change altitude, going higher or lower in the air and hopefully catch a current going somewhat in the direction you want to go in, which is fucking terrifying. Want to go south? Better go up another quarter mile in a rickety-ass wicker basket and hope it sends you that way. And all that brings us to the ancient city of Luxor, Egypt, or Thebes, as it was once called. Luxor is one of Egypt's top tourist destinations. Built along the banks of the Nile River in Upper Egypt, the city serves as an open-air museum of ancient Egyptian civilization. It's home to the Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, and some of the most spectacular temples ever constructed. The hot air balloon industry had been thriving here for years, offering tourists a unique aerial perspective of archaeological sites that stretched across the desert landscape. Which sounds awesome, if you ignore the terror of flying in a wooden basket filled with a bunch of flammable shit, especially since there was basically no safety regulations. Yeah, they existed on paper, but were never enforced. Since the 2011 revolution that effectively ended the presidency of Hosni Mubarak, there was a big governmental push not to fuck up the tourist industry. They wanted to keep money from tourism coming in, so they left them alone to do as they pleased as long as the money kept flowing in. And hot air balloon rides had become a huge moneymaker for Luxor and Egypt, with multiple companies running daily flights during the peak tourist season. Weather conditions in the region were generally favorable for ballooning, with calm morning winds and clear skies predominating throughout much of the year. The flights typically launched before dawn, allowing passengers to witness sunrise from several hundred feet above the ancient monuments. On the morning of February 26th, tourists from around the world gathered in the pre-dawn darkness for what promised to be the experience of a lifetime. A hot air balloon ride over the Valley of the Kings, the Temple of Karnak, and other ancient monuments of Upper Egypt drew visitors from across the globe. The early morning launch was timed perfectly to capture the golden rays of sunrise shining down on 3,000 years of history. 20 tourists gathered in the darkness for their scheduled balloon flight, and these people came from all over the world. British, French, Japanese, Hungarian, and Hong Kong Chinese visitors were all drawn to Egypt by its ancient wonders. And most of them were couples on vacations, retirees hoping to knock something off the bucket list, and the odd traveler seeking adventure in one of the most historically significant locations. The balloon they would board was operated by Sky Cruise, one of several companies providing balloon tours in Luxor. The pilot assigned to the flight was Momin Murad, who was an experienced Egyptian pilot who had been flying for about 8 years. The balloon itself was a standard commercial hot air balloon, and 20 people in a balloon sounds like a lot. I'm gonna assume it was fairly big, or they were crammed into this damn thing elbow to elbow. The pre-flight procedures appeared routine. Passengers were given basic safety briefings, instructed on the landing position they should assume when the balloon touched down, and helped aboard the large wicker basket that would serve as their gondola for the flight. The balloon's envelope was inflated with cold air using large fans, then heated air from the propane burners gradually lifted the massive envelope upright. As the first hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, the balloon lifted off, joining several other balloons already heading into the still morning air. The flight went smoothly for roughly 45 minutes. The balloon climbed to an altitude of around 1,000 feet, providing passengers with spectacular views as the sun rose over the Nile Valley. Below them, the ancient temples and monuments emerged from the darkness. Passengers snapped pics and enjoyed the unique view of the area, the silence broken only by periodic blasts from the propane burners heating the air, and anyone nearby inside the balloon. As the flight neared its ending, Murad began the descent procedure, gradually reducing the heat input to allow the balloon to settle toward its intended landing zone. And this part of the flight is critical in hot air ballooning, requiring careful judgment about wind conditions, descent rates, and the selection of an appropriate landing area. Make a mistake here and, well, imagine slamming an Easter basket filled with eggs on the ground, except you're one of the eggs, which doesn't sound like fun at all. As the balloon descended to around 10 feet, a rope was dropped to the waiting ground crew. During the landing, one of the fuel lines was ruptured, which was possibly caused by one of the landing ropes, but the exact cause was never determined. The broken fuel line led to a fire in the basket as it hovered a few feet off the ground. The fire spread quickly. Propane gas, which had been safely contained and controlled throughout the flight, now became a deadly accelerant. The flames quickly engulfed the basket and began spreading toward the balloon's envelope above. Panic erupted among the passengers as Murad attempted to grab a fire extinguisher and gain control before being struck back by the flames. Murad, covered in flames, along with one other passenger, jumped or either fell from the basket as it was close to the ground. Some of the ground crew released the rope as they rushed to the aid of the pilot, which fucked over the remaining passengers in the balloon. The remaining members of the 10-man landing crew could not hold down the balloon. With the growing fire pushing more hot air into the balloon and less weight with 2 people missing, the hot air balloon shot into the air. Thick black smoke trailed the balloon into the sky. In a desperate attempt to escape the flames, several more passengers jumped from the basket, which made the balloon continue higher. The growing flames now surrounded the propane tanks used to fuel the hot air balloon. Fire and propane tanks do not exactly go well together. They tend to turn into bombs and explode when exposed to fire. The balloon continued to rise, reaching an altitude of roughly 1,000 feet before the inevitable occurred. The propane tanks, subjected to intense heat and flame, exploded inside the basket. The explosion witnessed by people across the wide area of Luxor was a massive detonation that shattered the morning calm and sent a fireball into the sky. The explosion tore the balloon apart. The envelope, already fucked up by the fire, disintegrated, and the basket with its remaining passengers plummeted toward the earth. The fall from 1,000 feet took only seconds. The basket crashed into a sugarcane field near the village of Al-Dabiya, west of Luxor, striking the ground with devastating force. The crash site was a horror scene. The basket was destroyed, the balloon's remnants scattered across the field, and the victims of the crash lay amongst the wreckage. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but it was way too late. All they could do was begin securing the area and the grim task of recovering victims and collecting evidence. The accident killed 18 of the passengers on site. The pilot Murad and 2 other British passengers survived the initial crash. All 3 were rushed to the hospital in critical condition. One of the men, Joe Bampton, died after 5 hours of surgery. Dr. Mohammed Abdullah, the head of the emergency ward of the Luxor hospital, said that Joe, who had died in the hospital, had probably suffered a 160-foot fall. The other surviving Briton, Michael Rennie, was described as being in critical but stable condition, while Murad was said to be conscious and talking, but with burns covering 70% of his body. Doctors at the Luxor International Hospital said that many of the dead also suffered severe internal injuries and severe burns. Among the dead were 9 Hong Kong tourists from a group that had traveled together to explore Egypt. Their deaths had sent shockwaves through Hong Kong, where the crash dominated news coverage and prompted an outpouring of grief. The Hong Kong government immediately dispatched officials to Egypt to assist with the identification of victims and support for the bereaved families. 4 Japanese tourists also died in the crash, prompting similar grief and official response in Japan. The Japanese victims had been part of a tour group traveling together to experience the cultural and historical treasures of Egypt. Their deaths added to growing concerns in Japan about travel safety in regions affected by political instability. The 3 Britons and the Hungarian-born passenger, who was a resident of the UK, were on a tour organized by the Thomas Cook Group. The 2 French victims were a 48-year-old woman and her 14-year-old daughter. Egyptian authorities immediately suspended all hot air balloon flights in Luxor pending investigation, effectively shutting down an industry that had been a significant part of the local economy. The government formed an investigative committee to examine the cause of the accident and determine whether negligence or regulatory failure had contributed to the crash. The international response was swift and highly concerned. Multiple governments whose citizens had died sent officials to Egypt to monitor the investigation and assist their citizens. The British Foreign Office, the Hong Kong government, and officials from Japan, France, and Hungary all became involved in various capacities seeking answers for the families at home. The crash reignited long-standing concerns about safety standards in Egypt's tourism industry. Critics pointed out that ballooning operations in Luxor had been subjected to limited oversight despite the inherent risk involved. Questions arose about pilot training and certification, maintenance standards for balloons and equipment, and the adequacy of emergency procedures. The investigation into the crash examined the wreckage, interviewed survivors and witnesses, and reviewed records related to the balloon's maintenance and operation. And the investigation had challenges from the very beginning, since most of the evidence was destroyed in the crash. But the investigation did reveal troubling details about the circumstances of the flight. According to findings that emerged in the weeks following the crash, there were questions about whether proper pre-flight checks had been conducted and whether the balloon's equipment was in full compliance with safety standards. The fuel system, in particular, came under scrutiny, with investigators examining whether fuel lines or connections might have been compromised or improperly maintained. The investigation also looked at the hot air balloon industry as a whole. Records showed that the industry in Luxor had been operating with limited regulatory oversight. Pilot licensing requirements, maintenance standards, and safety protocols varied and were not consistently enforced. The insurance and liability frameworks were unclear, leaving questions about financial responsibility for the crash. The Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority released its final report on the crash on January 7, 2014. The 219-page report blamed a leak in a fuel line connected to the balloon's burner. The aging fuel line had been in use since 2005 and sprung a leak, which ignited as the balloon came into land. The fire severely injured the pilot, who fell from the basket. Some of the ground crew released the ground line in order to attend to the pilot so that the remaining crew could not keep the balloon near the ground. The flaming balloon rose rapidly and uncontrolled, then exploded. In the aftermath of the crash, Egyptian authorities announced reforms intended to improve safety in the ballooning industry. New regulations were promised, including more stringent pilot licensing requirements, mandatory maintenance standards, and improved oversight of balloon operations. The Civil Aviation Ministry pledged to implement international safety standards and conduct regular inspections of equipment and operations. Legal proceedings following the crash moved slowly through Egypt's court system. Questions of criminal responsibility, civil liability, and financial compensation for victims' families remain contentious. The complexity of determining fault in an accident involving multiple potential contributing factors, pilot error, mechanical failure, inadequate maintenance, regulatory shortcomings, made legal resolution difficult, and they were keeping a tight lid on the trials. They had charged the pilot, one of the chief maintenance officers, with negligence and manslaughter. As I'm recording this, I could not find what happened with those charges. I don't know if it's still going through court, although this was like 12 years ago, or if that information's never been released. I can't find an answer to what happened. Internationally, the crash prompted some countries to issue travel advisories or warnings about hot air balloon activities in Egypt. Tour operators in various countries reassessed their relationships with Egyptian balloon companies, and a lot of people who had booked balloon flights canceled their reservations. Egypt's tourism industry reputation took quite a bit of damage from this. The crash in Luxor would also go on to affect the international hot air balloon industry. While hot air ballooning is generally considered a safe recreational activity when conducted according to proper standards, accidents, though rare, can be catastrophic. I believe it's the FAA actually lists hot air ballooning the safest form of flight. The industry worldwide took notice of the Luxor crash and the factors that fell into it. The international ballooning organizations emphasized the importance of rigorous safety standards, proper pilot training, regular equipment maintenance, and adherence to established procedures. This crash underscored the risks associated with inadequate oversight and the dangers of allowing commercial pressures to compromise safety protocols, which tends to always end up being the way of things. Money is more important than safety. But anyways, in countries with more mature ballooning industries, the Luxor crash prompted reviews of existing safety frameworks, and in some cases actually led to enhanced regulations and enforcement efforts. Luxor, which depends heavily on tourism, felt the economic impact severely. While the ancient monuments continued to attract visitors, the balloon industry was struggling. Even after flights eventually resumed under supposedly improved safety regulations, many tourists remained wary. This crash, along with several others that had happened in the previous years, had demonstrated the potentially deadly consequences of safety failures, and gaining back tourist trust was extremely difficult. The overall Egyptian tourism industry struggled to recover from this, especially when you combine the effects of political instability and high-profile tragedies. Subsequent events, including terrorist attacks targeting tourists and continued political turmoil, further damaged Egypt's reputation as a safe destination. And that was the 2013 Luxor hot air balloon crash. Thanks for listening, and if you liked the show, please consider leaving a rating or review on your app of choice. And you can reach out to the show at historyisadisaster@gmail.com with questions, comments, or suggestions, as well as following the show on social media like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, whatever. And share the episode. Your friends will love it, hopefully. And take care of yourself out there. Chase that dream. Live for today, because tomorrow is never guaranteed. Thanks and goodbye.